morning, good morning, good morning. Starting with the new presentation, and as usual from previous presentation, you will see again the association between the Jewish festivals, which is the spiritual calendar, with the agricultural calendar. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but you know there is at least 7 species that the land Israel will offer. And these are the 7 species. You notice we've done one of the grains. We have already done the grapes. We've done the figs. You understand? And for this morning's one, we are going to go and look at some of the olives. So that's an interesting one. The olive tree, right? And if you can remember from the olive tree, something in Jerusalem, I don't know if you know this one, with previous presentation of the fig tree. If the fig tree didn't produce any fruit, then we wanted to cut it off, where the Mashiach has to basically intervene, right? And there's some interesting things. And why would you cut off? Because the Torah says you can cut off any tree that does not produce fruit, and you can use that for fire. So an interesting thing, when I grew up in rural areas, there was no electricity in the 70s, 80s, and we used to use wood for any fire. And we noticed that if you use the wood from a fig tree and you use the wood from a vine, something very interesting, that those trees used to make a lot of smoke, so a lot of air pollution, right? So it wasn't nice to basically use those type of trees for wood and use that as fuel. So olive is also one of them, you understand. And the reason for that is because there's a lot of fluids in the wood, right? And that is basically adding to the water. When you look at the olive, you understand, Rica, which is the olive tree, the Latin olive tree, is the tree that can basically grow up to 2,000 years, 3,000 years. So these trees have been now very long standing, do you understand, for many years. And what makes the olive tree for me so specific, and it makes it very peculiar, is the olive tree doesn't behave like another tree. Almost all trees behave through the seasons. So when it is basically autumn, the leaves become yellow, and when it is basically becoming winter, then there's no leaves, right? Because the tree is preparing itself for the winter season, right? The olive is just totally different right through the entire season, right? Whether it's winter or autumn, the olive tree's leaf kept being green, and that's referred to the Psalm. He says, they shall still yield their fruit on their old age, and they shall be full of sap and very green. So that's it. The olive tree is not influenced by the circumstances of the seasons. So that is basically how any Christian is supposed to be, right? You're not supposed to be influenced by your famine season, right? Even in a famine, you will always, you understand, having your leaf always being green. That's very, very, very important as a Christian, that you are not influenced by circumstances. When you have a lot, I love what Apostle Paul says, you understand, that he've discovered the secret to be content. He says, I was rich, I know what it is to have plenty and abundance, but I was also poor, I know what it is to live in a famine. But the mystery and the secret that I've discovered is to be content, but to keep on being green. Something very also interesting about the olive tree, by far, since it is not influenced by any of the circumstances surrounding it, is when there was a flood. And we know in the Noah flood, the entire world was basically covered with water. But the first tree that was not basically influenced by that water was the olive tree. Because Noah sent out a dove, and it came back with nothing. And then he sent it out again, and voila, came out with some leaves. You can see that, and that leaves was basically the olive leaf. So you can see how the olive leaf play an essential role. Well, this is part of the staple diet, since this is basically a very important part of the 7 species of the land of Israel. So when they have the Tash B'Av, which means the festival of the trees, then they eat all 7 of those upbringings that comes from the land of Israel. So that is when they eat also this. And the best way to eat this, they say, it is when it is about green. And then after it turns green, it has this color. This is the best color that you can basically, now you eat the olive. And you can see it's staple type of food that is mandatory, that's always been on the Jewish table. And that is why, if you notice that Joshua was 120, so Moses was also 120, and you hear that these people, they basically live past 100, which means they have this full life, is because of the Mediterranean diet. We've said that again. And you can have all types of important type of oil, but this guy is by far the best oil, which is basically the olive oil. Right, when you look at Ezekiel, and you also look at Revelations, an angel came to John and said, "Now take the scroll," and he started to eat the scroll. Notice the scroll was sweet in his mouth, but it turns sour when it was in his stomach. Well, basically can say that about the olive. Anybody who ate olive, it has this type of bitter sour taste. But then afterwards it starts to be turning sweet. So olive is very, 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 very good. And the best way you understand to extract something from olives, what olives is actually known of, is oil. The olive oil, right? The entire Bible writes about the olive oil. And the best way to get the best oil is, again, when the olive is just green and turning towards yellow. Now is the time to go and produce oil. And you cannot get to the oil. Let me stress that out. You cannot get to the oil if you do not crush. Oh, Ribanda Labasaya. Praise the Lord Jesus Christ of Nazareth, our Lord and Savior. You cannot have oil if you don't put it on the Latin word mortarium, the mill, the mortar. So to crush oil, to crush olives, to produce this drop that you can see out here. Can you see that? So olives have to be crushed. And we know the crushing part is not nice, right? Nobody wants to be crushed. No Christian wants to be crushed. And I love what Apostle Paul writes. He says, "My son, do not take lightly about the discipline of the Lord, because the Lord disciplines those that he loves." And then he says, "Endure hardships as a form of discipline." God will crush you for a reason. And when you have been crushed, it's because you will produce oil. Right? You will produce oil. So you cannot get to the oil if you are not crushed. And you can see, going back, Gethsemane, we've done this one. Geth, which is press, or wine press. And Seman, which is oil. Right? Shemani is oil. Gethsemane is the place where the olives have been crushed. But we knew when we did the wine, we found Gethsemane was also the place where the true vine was basically crushed. So you cannot get wine if the grapes is not crushed. You cannot get olive oil if the olive is not crushed. Can you see that? Now here's a remarkable thing. We know what happened in Gethsemane when the Mashiach went and prayed. This is the Mashiach's prayer. He says, "Lord, you understand, if it's in your will, you can take this cup away, you understand, for me." And what did he call the cup? The cup of suffering. Did you hear that? He says the cup. Where's this cup? What is he talking about? Right? If you remember, when he gave his disciples, after he ate the bread, he gave his disciples the cup. And he says, "Drink of it. This is the blood that will be poured out for you for the forgiveness of sins." The cup of suffering, the cup of affliction. Can you see that? So he's talking about that cup. So when he says take away the cup, he knew to get to the wine, you have to be crushed. He knows to get to the olive oil, the olive has to be crushed. And that is exactly what the prophet is saying. Right? The prophet is saying He was pierced for our transgressions. Isn't that something? Pierced for our transgressions, man. Yo, I like that one here. Surely he took our infirmities and he carried our sorrows. Yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him, and afflicted. Again, he was pierced for our transgressions. And here's my favorite one. And he was crushed for our iniquities. Can you see? Crushed. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him. And by his stripes, by his wounds, we are healed. Can you see that? It was the Lord's will. I love that part. To crush him. Do you hear that? The Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And now the Lord makes his life a guilt offering. He will see his offspring and prolong his days. The will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. Thus say the Lord. That's what the prophet says. To get to the oil, to get to the wine, crush the grapes. You see that? And that's interesting. Let's go to the crushing process. I love what they do. To produce the oil, they have this beam olive press. An interesting beam olive press. And notice, this ropes with its buckets, there it is. And you put your olive oil, your olives in there. And as you put your olives in there, you take this beam and you put a lot of weights upon that beam, and then you bring this thing down. And now the pulp will be squeezed. And those buckets that is having all the olives in it, as you're squeezing it, you are basically crushing the olive. And that is how you will basically now producing the oil. And now that you have the oil is now something very interesting. So let me spend some time on here. The Hebrew word for oil that they love to use in the Bible is called shemem. From the Hebrew word shamun. That's interesting, which means fat. Which means oil is part of the fat, animal fat, which is like the lipids. But this is plant oil. Can you see that from the one called shemen? But when you crush the olive, the immediate crushing and the producing of those sap, that oil, is called hitzar. Hitzar from the Hebrew verb zohar, same gematre, meaning noon. But how is the association and connection between that? Hitzar is the oil one. Because at noon, we will light up a candle using the olive oil, and that light will basically resemble the sunlight at noontime. Wow, that's why Hitzar is so important. And you can see Hitzar, the name is from the genealogy of Levi. Well, we had Levi had a son, he called him Kohath, and Kohath had like his children, Amram, in which Moses and Aaron was born. And you can see this one, Hitzar, is the interesting one. And you can see that Hitzar, from which the name oil is. Can you see that? Which the name oil is coming from. And he had a son called Korach. And Hitzar, because now you notice that once you produce the oil cannot mix with water. Let me say that again. Oil cannot mix with water, but oil always float on top of water because of its density. That's interesting. So Hitzar is basically a reflection of the olive oil, right? And to produce the oil, you have to crush the grapes. It's related to the Jewish nation. Right, wherever the Jewish nation went in exile, they are being crushed by those communities. But like the oil's density, they always float on top. They always basically are the ones with that offensive blessing. They are basically the determining factors of any type of economy. The Jewish people ask Egypt, who ran Egypt? Joseph. You have a Jew there that runs your finances. You know what happened with Egypt. Nobody could prosper. Even the entire world was in a famine. Because the Jew ran it. You understand? Who runs the whole street, people? Jewish nation. Why was Hitler so against the Jews? Because they ran Germany. Why was Stalin and Lenin so against the Lithuanian Orthodox community? These people are running the diamond industry. Man, in South Africa, some rapper basically said it very, 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 very interesting. He talks about orange juice concentrated. I listened to that line. You know the history in South Africa. Cecil John Rhodes. They are running actually the diamond place. The Oppenheimer family. These people are not even South African. They came here and just running the entire economy. JSE, Johannesburg Stock Exchange. What can I say about them? You crush them, they float on top. There is nothing you can do. Wall Street basically collapsed in 1925. You know, the entire world collapsed. You crush the Jew, his oil starts to float on top. Now that's even 100 times worse for Christians. You crush the Christian. That is how the gospel starts to basically prosper. The gospel prosper in opposition. The gospel always prosper when there is crushing. You understand? And to be a Christian in any of these Islamic countries and Mediterranean countries, you understand, these people are basically being stoned to death and put in prison and being killed. Yet, gospel continues to prosper. Wow. You crush. They are like olives. You crush them. And that's the Mashiach's word as well. John actually writes it better. John says that when you have been crushed because of righteousness, he says the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon you. That is an interesting statement. So, from the genealogy, you can see that there's Kohath, there's Amram, there's Aaron and Aaron's sons, right? There's Moses and Eleazar's sons, and interesting. And we have Itzhar and Korah. So that's interesting. And that Korah fellow, well, the Bible talks about in the last days, there's a lot of demons that will be released. One of the demons that will be released, together with ungratefulness, of disobedience, brutality, unclean, evil. One of them is called ungratefulness. Did you hear that? Ungratefulness. And here's the sad part of ungratefulness. It's a subconscious sin. You're not actually aware that you're ungrateful. You're not aware that you are committing the sin when you're ungrateful. When you see this sight in front of me, this is something that needs to last for entire year. If you see water open in front of you and you walk through dry ground, you cannot complain. You're in such a high that you will tell everybody for entire year. This is the sad part. The Jewish community, none of the plagues came to them. None of the 10 plagues touched them. And now they went through this sensation and they see this. Sad, they started to complain. Can a person be so ungrateful? And I'm thinking like they would complain like maybe in a year's time. They just complain the next day. Really? Really? If you look at this Korah and his family from the Levite community, Moses separated them because Korah, if you look at this one, he was a judge, people. So Korah was basically very wealthy. From the Talmud, the man is very, very wealthy, and his influences is, but Moses is just a humble fellow, and Moses appointed Aaron as the high priest, and Korah didn't like that. He said, this is nepotism, you can't basically put your brother there. And then Moses had to basically prove it to them. He said, bring me a staff. All of them bring their staff, and Aaron's staff was basically the almond tree, and that's the only staff that basically did not just blossom, but it started to produce almonds. That's why Jews always look for miraculous signs. That's what they always ask the Mashiach. Show us a miracle. Jews looking for miraculous signs to believe. Moses just had enough of Korah and said, everybody come and stand here from the Levite community. And anybody that's on the side of Korah, you go and stand on that side. And when they did that, Korah, his family, his children, even the livestock people, even the livestock The earth just opened and all of them went straight to hell. That's so sad. Now, if you see a sight like this, it means it's still going to be fresh in your mind. What just happened? If you resist Moses, if you basically lift up your heel against the leader of God, against the anointed of God. The next day the Jewish people complain. Really, didn't you see? Yesterday what happened to Korah? They complained the next day. Now I had enough. I am finished. This presentation is made up of parts. I'm going to load part 2 now. Thank you very much. May God bless you and continue to listen to the entire parts of the olive. And I hope you are basically blessed.